All right, so what's up, guys? Today we're going to be talking about the anatomy of the brain. This video is going to be a lot more complicated than the other ones we've had so far, and it's also going to be slightly longer because we're going to be delving deeper into the nervous system and more into the functional anatomy of our brain. So, to start things off, we're going to talk about the four lobes of the brain, which we'll cover a little bit later as well, but just to give you all an overview. The frontal lobe, which is highlighted in blue, the parietal lobe, which is highlighted in yellow, the occipital lobe, which is in pink, and the temporal lobe, which is in green. So, the frontal lobe is primarily responsible for our logical reasoning and thoughts with language, emotion, and movement, and it also contains our motor cortexes. The parietal lobe is primarily responsible for processing sensory information, and it contains our somatosensory cortexes. The occipital lobe is responsible for interpreting visual information, and our temporal lobe is responsible for hearing, memory, emotion, and language. So it kind of works in tandem with several other lobes. And I mean, all lobes will work in tandem with others, but the temporal lobe especially. One cool thing to know is that our lobes are all named after the cranial bones they lie on. Well, not, they lie on. So, not lie on, but they lie on top or below. So, the bones are on top of these lobes, but they're labeled as such. So, your frontal bone, for example, lays on top of your frontal lobe, and that's why your frontal lobe is named as such. Same with parietal bone, occipital bone, and temporal bone. So, little typo there, but yeah, as long as you understand that the lobes are named after the bones for which they lie under. Now, there are four primary regions of the brain. Obviously, the brain is very convoluted and complex, but to simplify things, there are four primary regions to be aware of. The first is the cerebral hemisphere. The second is your diencephalon. The third is your brainstem. And the fourth is your cerebellum. Now, we're going to be talking about each of these four primary regions in depth, and we're going to walk through it all. We're going to be starting with the cerebral hemisphere, also known as our cerebrum. So, this consists of the left and right superior most parts of the brain. Now, if you're unfamiliar with anatomical terminology, superior just means topmost or towards the head. So, saying superior most parts of the brain just means the topmost part of the brain. And this will actually contain more than half of our brain mass, which is pretty substantial. So, a little extra information is that we've got a couple of definitions for the grooves and the ridges of our brain. They've actually got names. I know it's kind of crazy, but the gyri are the ridges on the surface, and the sulci are the grooves. Now, we have deeper grooves, which are referred to as fissures, and the most well-known one is the longitudinal fissure. So, the longitudinal fissure is this thing right here, dotted in this black dotted line, and it kind of marks the division between our left and our right cerebral hemispheres. Um, Another quick side note, this is labeled an anatomical view, so our right hemisphere will be from our perspective on the left because you're looking at it as if it's right in front of you. But this would be the right hemisphere, this would be the left hemisphere. I know it's a little confusing, but the more you practice with it, it'll become second nature. Now, there are three main regions in your cerebral hemisphere, and the first one is the cerebral cortex, the second one is your white matter, and your third one is the basal nuclei. So, starting with the first one, we've got the cerebral cortex. This consists of gray matter and is the outer layer of the skin. We'll talk a little more about gray matter, but gray matter is essentially, consider it your cell bodies, your neuronal cell bodies, and white matter is the axon that's myelinated. Whenever you myelinate an axon, it'll have a white, shiny appearance, but there's no myelin on a neuronal cell body, so that's why it's gray matter. Again, it's divided into four lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. The frontal lobe has the primary motor cortex in Broca's area. The primary motor cortex is responsible for production of conscious and skilled movements. And your Broca's area is responsible for speech production, and this is usually located in the left hemisphere of your brain. I'm going to toss another mnemonic out there for y'all, but Broca's area is for speech production. I know, kind of dumb, but it helps because there are lots of parts of the brain and it will get confusing. So Broca's area, production, speech production. So kind of helps, but we've also got the primary somatosensory cortex, which is in the parietal lobe, and this receives sensory information for pain, temperature, and light touch. It does not receive special sensory impulses such as sight, sound, taste, smell, hearing, etc. So your primary somatosensory cortex is just sensory information for pain, temperature, and light touch. There are several areas in your brain that are responsible for the special sensory impulses. An example is your gustatory area in your parietal lobe that is for the taste. I think it's gustatory. I don't know why I said gustatory. Whatever, y'all get it. That area in the parietal lobe senses taste. But some more examples are your olfactory and auditory cortexes in the temporal lobe. So your olfactory cortex will be for smell, and your auditory cortex will be for hearing in relation to speech and language. And we've also got the visual cortex in the occipital lobe, and visual cortex is for vision. Now, this funky looking thing down here is known as a homunculus for our brain. It's a very common way to represent how each portion of our brain has an importance to a specific region. So the larger an area is with respect to the brain, the more relation it has to it. So this area has a greater relation to your face compared to this area with your head and neck. This is just showing you how, as you traverse your brain, you have different areas responsible for different regions of your body. Next up, we've got cerebral white matter. So, cerebral white matter is named such because it is describing the myelinated axons that shoot deeper into your brain. So, if you think about this is your brain. You've got cell bodies here, neuronal cell bodies here. This is all gray matter because these are the cell bodies. And you've got neuron or axons going deeper into the brain. And these are all going to be myelinated, so they're going to be a white, shiny appearance. And that's why this part is known as white matter, and this part is known as gray matter. So your cerebral white matter will also form the corpus callosum. Now, the corpus callosum is this giant, or not giant, but a pretty sizable bundle of neuron fibers that contain or that connects the two hemispheres of your brain. This is known as a commissure tract. There are several types of tracts. The two most prominent ones are your association and your projection fiber tracts. So your association fiber tracts will connect areas within your brain hemispheres, and your projection fiber tracts will connect your cerebrum with your lower centers, such as your spine. So the axons drawn in red will be your association fiber tracts. You notice how they're all contained within the brain, communicating with different portions of your brain. You have your axon fiber tracts in green, which are your projection fiber tracts, which are responsible for taking information and bringing it deeper into your spinal tracts and going farther into your body. And this blue thing is just your corpus callosum, which is that bundle of fibers that connects your two hemispheres. The third portion of our cortex, or our cerebral cortex, of the cerebral hemisphere, I just had a blank, is your basal nuclei. Now, your basal nuclei are little pockets of gray matter that are buried really deep within your white matter. So these are responsible for voluntary motor activities. They kind of regulate these movements. So think of it as a checkpoint. Your brain will be like, hey, let's have a movement such as this. Let's go move our legs. Let's go move our legs and walk over there. It'll go through our basal nucleus, and our basal nucleus will be like, do we really want to do this? Is this just white noise, or is this something that's benefiting us? And it'll filter it. If it approves it, it'll go to the skeletal muscle and we'll do that action. If it filters it out, it'll just not be approved and just be cut off. So it's kind of like a checkpoint that approves or rejects instructions sent from our primary motor cortex. So these are the three primary things for a cerebral hemisphere: the cerebral cortex, the white matter, and the basal nuclei. Those will be our three primary regions. Now, our second primary region of the brain is the diencephalon. Now, the diencephalon is located on top of your brainstem and is enclosed by your cerebral hemispheres. So it's deeper into your brain, and the whole point of the diencephalon is to serve as a relay and processing center for sensory information and autonomic control. There are three structures in your diencephalon. You have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. On the brain I drew on the right-hand side, you can see that I highlighted different areas where these structures will be found, and together these form your diencephalon. Now, let's start with the thalamus. So, your thalamus serves as your brain's relay station for all sensory information except smell. Now, senses will be filtered by your thalamus prior to being sent to the respective cortex. So, think of your thalamus as yet another checkpoint where sensory information first crosses the thalamus and your thalamus judges, is this worthy of going further for being processed? If it deems it so, it'll go and send it out to the respective cortexes. It kind of filters it out and organizes it. It also encloses the third ventricle of the brain. That's just more of a locational thing, so if you're studying anatomy or you need to identify where the thalamus is or where the third ventricle is, this will just help with that. Your hypothalamus makes up the floor of your diencephalon, and it serves as the coordinating center for your brain, and it maintains homeostasis. Homeostasis is just the neutral state of your body with its most optimal function. So it'll regulate body temperature, hunger, thirst, sleep, emotion, etc. by utilizing hormones to directly influence and manage your autonomic nervous system. So think of your hypothalamus as the AC unit, right? If the temperature goes too high or the temperature goes too low, the AC in your house will try to mediate and bring it back to that central point. Similarly, that's how your hypothalamus functions. If your body's too out of whack, it'll impact and release hormones to bring your body back to its original neutral point. It does so by regulating the pituitary gland, which is the primary gland of the brain that releases these hormones. Finally, we have the epithalamus. Now, the epithalamus forms the roof of the third ventricle, and it houses our pineal gland. Now, our pineal gland is responsible for secreting melatonin and regulating our sleep-wake cycle, and it just assists in homeostasis as well with our sleep patterns. It also includes the choroid plexus, which, again, we'll talk about this way later about cerebrospinal fluid and how ventricles work and the flow of CSF in our system. But for now, just know that the epithalamus, since it is involved with the third ventricle, it will include the choroid plexus, which secretes cerebrospinal fluid, which will enter the third ventricle and be circulated throughout the brain. The third primary region of our brain is our brainstem. The purpose of our brainstem is to send messages relating to autonomic functions like breathing, heartbeat, balance, digestion, etc. to the body. So this connects the cerebrum of our brain to the spinal cord and cerebellum. So it's kind of the base of our brain, hence the brain stem, and it's kind of that junction point that's holding things up. So there's three parts of our brain stem. We've got the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain will involve the movement of our body and head due to the channels and pathways involved with cerebral peduncles. Now, this is a little deeper into the anatomy. We won't be covering all the peduncles and other parts of the brain in this video, but what you should know is there are ascending and descending pathways that travel through the cerebral peduncles. There's some in our cerebellum as well, and this will assist with moving our head and moving our body. Now, the midbrain also contains the cerebral aqueduct and corpora quadrigemina. So your aqueduct will just relate to the ventricle system again. So it'll have your third and fourth ventricles, and the corpora quadrigemina has your two visual and your two auditory reflex centers, one for each hemisphere, and it assists in visual and auditory reflexes, hence the name. But with that being said, that's just a very brief overview of the midbrain without getting too lost in all the details and getting too deep into it. We've got the pons, which is the second part of our brainstem. It's kind of this rounded beer belly structure, and it lies just below the midbrain. Functionally or structurally, it links the medulla with the thalamus, and it serves to transfer information. It's kind of another transferring station where it'll assist the surrounding structures, and it serves as a kind of a bridge. So it'll assist with regulating respiration and assisting in the sleep-wake cycle. Now, finally, we've got the medulla oblongata, which is a very important portion of our brainstem. It is the part that keeps all of our autonomic functions practically functioning, or the ones that are very essential to life. And these are heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, swallowing, vomiting. So your medulla is this inferior portion that, inferior meaning, if you're again unfamiliar with anatomical terminology, inferior just means lower in respect to another thing. But this is the inferior most part of our brainstem, and it actually merges into our spinal cord. And the whole point of the medulla, as I said before, is to regulate these autonomic functions like breathing and heartbeat and swallowing and vomiting, and it's very, very important. The fourth primary region and the last primary region of our brain is the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is located posteriorly to the brain, so back of the brain, and it underlies the occipital and the temporal lobes of our cerebral cortex. Again, that's just locational to help you understand where the cerebellum will be located. On an actual brain, the cerebellum will be very easy to find because it's the back lower portion of your brain and it kind of juts out a bit. It's very identifiable. And the cerebellum contains more than half of all of your body's neurons. That still takes me by surprise just to think about because the cerebellum is not that big, but the fact that it contains more than half of all of our neurons is just incredible because it showcases how important our cerebellum is. The primary functions of our cerebellum are to regulate and it's responsible for smooth, coordinated movement. Any movement that is coordinated is done through the cerebellum, and that it smoothens our movements out. So you're not jittery, you're not shaking, you're not moving around erratically. Everything that's voluntarily smooth and coordinated will be provided by your cerebellum. It's also very responsible for proper balance and posture. So the cerebellum is a very important part of our brain, and I just wanted to really make that clear because it will probably be tested on, and it's very good to know a lot about the cerebellum. But just to recap everything we talked about, just really briefly, we've got four primary regions in our brain. First one is the cerebrum, and it consists of three things: the cerebral cortex, the cerebral white matter, and basal nuclei. Your cerebral cortex is this outer gray matter lining that overlies the four lobes of the brain: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. We've also got cerebral white matter, which consists of the myelinated axonal fibers going deep into the brain for communication. And we've got the basal nuclei, which are these pockets or islands of gray matter that filter movement and accept or reject movement. The second the second primary region of the brain is the diencephalon. So the diencephalon has three structures: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. The thalamus is a sensory relay station for everything but smell. For smell, it'll go directly to the olfactory cortex just because of how our olfactory bulb is set up. That's going to be another video, but just think of the thalamus as this relay station for all of your senses except for smell. Your hypothalamus is a coordination center for your autonomic nervous system, and it adjusts your body to go back to its set neutral point via hormones. Think of the AC example we talked about earlier, where if you have a AC in your house and it gets too hot or too cold, your AC will function to bring your house's temperature back to normal or whatever it's set at. Similarly, the hypothalamus serves the exact same function to bring your body back to its set point. Epithalamus houses the pineal gland in your choroid plexus. Your choroid plexus is for secreting cerebrospinal fluid, and your pineal gland is for secreting melatonin and regulating your sleep-wake cycles. Then we've got our brainstem, which consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So the midbrain is responsible for the movement of our body and head. The pons transfers information and acts as kind of a bridge between the cerebellum and the motor cortex, and it's responsible for breathing in the sleep-wake cycle. Also, it's for the medulla and the thalamus. The medulla or the medulla oblongata is very essential for autonomic functions like heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, swallowing, and vomiting. Your cerebellum is the fourth primary brain region, and this is responsible for balance and posture, as well as smooth, coordinated movement. It is a very, very important part of your brain. Well, all of our brain's important, obviously, but the cerebellum especially is one of the most vital portions of our brain. And the two diagrams below that are drawn are just to showcase the lobes and the four primary regions and their locations. With that being said, that is all I have for y'all for this video. We talked a lot about the four primary brain regions and the lobes, but I hope this information was helpful. We will cover more later.